It's Memorial Day, and if you'll just humor me a minute, my father was a vet, served in World War II in the Army Tank Corps. He was injured during World War II. I remember growing up as a child, very much vets, and particularly also the VA system, which back, no comment about now, but back in those days, the VA system did very many wonderful things for my father and for our family. Then I became of age. It was the Vietnam War, and if I can be completely truthful with you folks, Uncle Sam didn't call me, and I did not volunteer. So I never served a day in the military. But then two things happened which really rose the issues of veterans in the military to me. First, my oldest son, Joshua, enlisted in the Army and served not one but 2 tours of duties in Iraq. He was injured during his second tour. I remember going to Brooke Army Medical down in Texas, as the troops call it, BAMSI, and also Walter Reed in Washington. And I just very much admire what my oldest son has done. He's been very active with vets. As a matter of fact, he was just honored. When he went to George Mason University, he started a fund for a scholarship for vets at the school. The second thing that happened was that I started to get to know the veterans, the men and women who served in the military at my church, Unity of Fairfax. Now, I'm not trying to get super political or anything else like that, but I think in recent years, some really silly nonsense has been said by people like me who have never served a day in the military about war, about the military, etc. And yet when I turn to the vets vets are in the Unity movement, I get a degree of wisdom and understanding from them that is incredible. They're not peaceniks. They're not in favor of universal disarmament. But you know what? They wrestle with the issue of just war, an issue which Christian theologians have wrestled with down through the ages, from Augustine to Aquinas, down in the modern era to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and believe that there are times where there are just wars. They also know that missions which are not well thought out can lead to disastrous results. And they're also on their guard to look for mission creep. And so I would like to honor, and I met similar vets in Unity Village Chapel, I'd like to honor the vets not just for their service which they gave the country in the past. I'd like to honor them for the service which I think so many of the vets are bringing to today. That American jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "For every problem there is an answer which is neat, simple, and wrong." And I believe that a lot of times these vets who are in our Unity movement are bringing a wisdom, a profound wisdom, to complex issues which are needed. So if I could ask anybody currently serving in the armed forces, if you could stand up, we honor you. Could our vets please stand up? Could our vets please stand up? And family members of vets, please would you stand up? Thank you. I tried to think, although I never served in the military, I tried to think, well, where did I serve which was a little like the military? Before I got the call to ministry, I was chief economist and headed up research for the United Way system. And United Way is a big bureaucracy too, and just like the military, there's hurry up and wait. And we used to say in United Way, for the vets, I'm sure many of this is similar, there's the right way of doing things, there's the wrong way of doing things, and there's the United way of doing things. But very much like vets, so many vets have a real pride for the branch of the armed forces they served in. I too have a real pride for United Way. It does so much social good. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to be passing around pledge cards. But the other thing which I also deeply, I thank the United Way system, I got to meet some really interesting and famous people. Like who? Well, I got to meet Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And that was really important to me. Let me explain why. Because back when I was like around 5 or 6 years old, my best friend, my best bud was Alex, who lived across the road from us. And Alex's father got promoted to a job. His corporation was taking him to South Africa. So they held a big party for Alex and his family, and I went over. And they showed colored sound movies. Now, that may not sound like much today. I mean, you just pop the DVD in or you stream it. But believe me, back in those days, it was impressive. And shown on a bed sheet, no less. And there were all these, in South Africa, all these smiling white faces at the beach. And I came back to my family and I said, Mom and Dad, Alex is so lucky he's going to South Africa and it looks so wonderful and all that. My father sat me down and said, let me tell you about South Africa. Let me tell you about apartheid. And he explained apartheid to me. And he said, Rick, the sad thing is, how long? It's injustice. And how long do you think that can go on? It's a pressure cooker. And it's going to explode. And unfortunately, when it explodes, there's going to be a violent bloodbath. And that stuck with me. And quite frankly, South Africa could have been a violent bloodbath if it hadn't been for people like Nelson Mandela, for Desmond Tutu, and so many other people in South Africa. So anyway, Desmond Tutu was speaking to a United Way convention in Baltimore, a big convention, and I got the honor of being his angel. Every speaker got an angel to help him out. If Al Capone was invited to speak to a United Way conference, he would have gotten an angel too, although I'd rather be Desmond Tutu's angel than Al Capone's angel, quite frankly. So anyway, I walked up to Archbishop Desmond Tutu and I said, Archbishop, in a few minutes, I'm going to hand you a microphone, and we're going to ask you to go out on stage, and we ask you to speak for 10 minutes. And he looked at me, and he said, oh, son, you must be a man of great faith, because you're giving me, a preacher, a microphone. And then you expect me to speak for only 10 minutes? Then he looked at me, he's quoting the Bible, he said, oh, son, such faith I have not seen in all of the house of Israel. So I gave him the microphone. He walked out on stage. He spoke for an hour and a half. Every minute was a beautiful, beautiful talk. I also got to meet George Clooney, the actor. George Clooney served on the board of United Way. I was called up to the president of the United Way's office, and he said to me, Rick, of course, George Clooney serves on the board. He's going to be coming to the next meeting. I want you to know, George Clooney's much more than just a pretty face. He's a very brilliant man, very sensitive, and he's really concerned about the rise of income inequality. I want you to write a background paper on the rise of income inequality and the impacts it's having. And then during the board meeting, there'll be a lull. I'll point to you. You go up to Clooney. You present the paper. Okay, got it? I said, yes, sir. He looked at me and said, Rick, I know you. You think a short paper is a 50-page paper with footnotes. 2 pages, no footnotes. Capiche? Capiche. So it's the board meeting day. I get there. I got to tell you, when George Clooney showed up to board meetings, no woman at United Way was sick that day. Literally. So I'm standing there in the sidelines, and the president comes over to me. There's a lull. He says, okay, get him, Tiger. And I'm just about to walk out. This woman, I kid you not, this woman to the left of me jams her elbow into me. A woman to the right of me pulls me back. I felt like I was in the middle of WrestleMania. They scoot on ahead and go to George Clooney. I'm sitting there disheveled. I'm straightening myself up. Finally, I walk over to I say, hello, Mr. Clooney. He looks at me and he says, what happened to you, pal? You look like the queen of the roller derby. I also got to meet Bill Gates. The Gates family are very close to United Way. Bill Gates' mother, Mary Gates, served as the board chair of United Way many, many years ago. And as a matter of fact, there's stories of some of the board meetings she came to. Young little Billy Gates came along too and was, going around the building and all that. But the Gates of the family that I really got to know the best was William Gates Sr., Bill Gates' father. Bill Gates Sr. was a quite successful Seattle lawyer before Bill set up Microsoft and all that. And both Bill and Melinda Gates will tell you, so much of what they learned about philanthropy and the importance of philanthropy came from William Gates Sr., came from the father. So anyway, it was a few board meetings later, and I'm presenting a proposal to the board, and I'm getting raked over the coals by William Gates Sr. Whoa. So finally, it's the cocktail hour. I'm sitting there with my glass of club soda, and Mr. Gates walks up to me, and he said, "That was a good paper you presented today." And I'm sitting there thinking, boy, if that was a good paper, I hate to see what would have happened to me if it was a bad paper. And then I looked at him and I said, Mr. Gates, I always wondered what I would have done if I were in your shoes. Because remember, Bill Gates dropped out of Harvard and then went off to found Microsoft. Well, I looked at Mr. Gates. I think if I were in your shoes, I would have said to Bill, you graduate Harvard first. You're not going to be a dropout. You graduate Harvard first, then you can go out and found your cockamamie software company. And Mr. Gates laughed at me and he said, "Oh, I could have said that, but he wouldn't have listened to me anyway. And besides, it was the right time. There was a very small window of opportunity for him to do that." At United Way, I also got to, because of the relationship with the National Football League, I also got to meet a lot of NFL players, National Football League players. Now, I know a lot of us, when we think of professional athletes, we think of people who punch out their girlfriends in elevators or carry loaded handguns in the glove compartment. And now I know the NFL probably was highly selective in the players they sent to us. But be that as it may, the NFL players I met were really very, very decent people, most of them family men, and most of them highly spiritual. As a matter of fact, when I told them that I had the call to ministry and was going to leave, they were very supportive and very, very interested. There's one NFL player in particular I'd like to talk to you about. His name is Stephen Weatherford. Stephen Weatherford is a punter, a kicker. He's the kind of guy who really puts his foot into the word football. He's been in the NFL for over 10 years. Over 10 years. Now, when you and I hear NFL, we think National Football League. But among the players, NFL stands for something different. It stands for not for long. You're not going to be around here for long. So Steve Weatherford has been in the league for over 10 years. He started with the New Orleans Saints. Played many years with the New York Football Giants. As a matter of fact, his Super Bowl ring comes from playing with the Giants. He was born and raised in Indiana. Comes from a fairly religious family. I believe they're Methodists. The part of the story which starts off, which I really, when he tells it, I really like hearing. He was in first or second grade, and his mother gets a phone call. Ring, 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 ring. Hello? Is this Mrs. Weatherford? Yes. Mrs. Weatherford, this is Stevie's mom. This is Stevie's teacher. And his mom says, well, is Steve in trouble? And she said, well, not really, Mrs. Weatherford. Now, wait a minute. Stevie's a good guy. He really is a good kid. But today during reading class, we were inside, and Stevie's turning cartwheels and handsprings in the class. It's really hard to teach reading while he's doing that, Mrs. Weatherford. Well, they got a few more calls like that, and the parents turned to Stevie and they said, Steve, why do you do that? And Steve said, I don't know, I just got the jitterbug, Mom and Dad, I got the jitterbug. Well, they took him to a series of doctors. The doctors came back and said, it appeared, Mrs. Weatherford, it appears your son has a really serious case of ADHD, attention deficit disorder. Here's what we would suggest. We would suggest heavy doses of Ritalin and these other drugs, and we think this will fill the bill. His parents didn't want to do that. So cold Indiana mornings, Mrs. Weatherford gets on a bicycle and says, come on, Steve. And Stevie's out running in front of his mom. They thought maybe they could run it out of him. It worked a little bit, but not that much, not all that much. But then they got another brilliant idea. Soccer. Maybe Stevie can run up and down the field and kick the ball all over the place and get some of that jitterbug out of him. It worked a little bit, but not all that much. And they prayed about it, for the jitterbug, as it were, to be lifted from Steve, but it wasn't. It wasn't. But nevertheless, Steve started attracting notice as this great little soccer player. He's in a lot of traveling leagues and doing quite well. It reaches 9th grade, and one day the high school football coach comes over to him and says, "Steve, have you ever thought about kicking a football?" And Steve says, "No." He said, "Well, would you like to try?" "Sure." And the coach says, "Well, here are the basics in terms of kicking a football," shows him and says, "Here, you do it." Steve takes the football. That ball goes a country mile. Whoa. The coach says, "Well, maybe that was a fluke. Let's see it again." Throws him another football. Steve takes it, bam, kicks it. It goes a country mile and a quarter. The coach says, "Hey, Steve, how'd you like to play on the high school football team?" 9th grade, little kid. "How'd you like to play on the high school football team?" And Steve says, "Sure, let's give it a try." So Steve becomes the punter on the high school football team. Now, one of the eternal verities I have learned when speaking to a Unity audience is do not assume that everybody sitting there is an aficionado of football. So, okay, no judgment or anything. But anyway, let's remind ourselves, when you have to punt the ball away to the other team, if the ball lands in their end zone and they don't return it, that's called a touchback. The ball gets moved out to the 20-yard line. It's 1st and 10 on the other team's 20-yard line. But that's not often the case when Stevie's against you. Steve, even in high school, had the ability to kick the football so it would just scoot out on the 1 or 2-yard line. Whoa. So now the other team gets the ball, not 1st and 10 on the 20. They get it 1st and 10 on the 1 or 2-yard line. They start out deep in the hole. The other thing, I came from a high school which had a very good high school football team, but my memory, the field goal was not a part of the game. With Steve Weatherford, even in high school, he could kick really impressive field goals. And let's remind ourselves, your team's on a drive, and the drive stalls on the 30-yard line. You get 0, nada, a goose egg. But not if Steve Weatherford's there. Steve will kick you a three-point football, a field goal. And to quote that former Republican leader of the Senate, Everett McKinley Dirksen, 3 points might not sound like much, but as McKinley Dirksen used to say, $1 billion here and $1 billion there, soon you're talking about real money, And the point after attempts. In high school, a lot of times you're running the ball because you're not going to the kicker because it's problematic for the extra point. But not with Steve. If I can mix sports metaphors, with Steve kicking the after point, it's more or less a mulligan. So anyway, Steve is establishing an incredible record as a punter in high school, but the jitterbug is still there. It's not going away. And no prayers are getting it lifted or anything else like that. Steve graduates. He goes to the University of Illinois. It's a full scholarship. And he's continuing to be a great field goal kicker, a great punter. But now, other thoughts start coming into his head. Really weird thoughts like, did I turn the coffee pot off? And if I didn't turn the coffee pot off and the building burns down, I'm going to hell. Or I have to alphabetize my books before it's noon, or something dreadful will happen. Or if I walk to the bus stop and there are more than 12 cracks between me and the bus stop, I can't even contemplate that. And Steve went to see psychiatrists. He was diagnosed with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. He's just holding it together with football and all that. Some good things happened to him also at the University of Illinois. Besides football, he met his wife, Laura, there. She's also active in sports. They later on got married, and they have 4 wonderful children. Steve graduated from Illinois, and the New Orleans Saints signed him up to be their field goal kicker and their place kicker and their punter. So he goes down to training camp, and he sees people in the training camp, who were idols to him when he was a kid. And Steve's thinking, oh my God, I'm such a walking fruitcake. I mean, if the New Orleans Saints ever knew what was going through my head, they never would have signed me up. And he's praying, please, God, please lift this from me. It's not just me, it's also, this is the opportunity of a lifetime, and I don't want to blow it. And it's not just me, it's also building a life with Laura, and we're going to have children, and I could see it all going down the tubes. Please, lift this from me. And Steve's prayer very much reminds me of somebody else who many years ago prayed that if this cup could be lifted from him. But in both cases, the cup was not lifted. It also reminds me very much of the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul had many wonderful spiritual victories, but there was a thorn in his flesh. In Paul's own words, there was a thorn in his flesh, which no amount of prayer could lift. I imagine that Paul went through many long, dark nights of the soul over this thorn in his flesh. But eventually what came to him, what Spirit said to him, I am made perfect in weakness. I am made perfect in weakness. And Paul could go on to say, when I am weak, then I am strong. Or to translate into 21st century argot, when finally I realize that my frail and flimsy ego is not going to save my Paducah. It's at that point that my heart can break and I can become open to that beyond that is within. Or as one of the 12-step fellowships has put it so well, I think, in their literature they say, but I'm too weak, I'll never make it. And it goes on to continue to say, don't worry, we have all thought and said the same thing. The amazing thing of the program is just that. It's weakness. It is weakness, not strength, that binds us to a higher power and to each other. And Steve, in that locker room, heard. Now, I don't care whether you call it the Christ within, Buddha nature, the Atman, Ruach, Hashem, higher self, higher power, call it what you will. Steve Weatherford unmistakably heard. And he heard, Steve, one of two things are going to happen. Either your liabilities are going to destroy you, or you can turn your liabilities into assets. You can turn your liabilities into assets. And Steve said, well, if those are my two options, I'll take what's behind door number 2. And so he started to think about, how can I turn my liabilities into assets? And he started thinking, what could be more OCD-ish than punting a football? I mean, punting a football is snap, step, kick. Snap, step, kick. How do you kick a football when the center's having an off day? Snap, step, kick. Snap, step, kick. The great sports hero, John Madden, used to talk about football being played in foul weather, or he called it slobber knockle. How do you kick a football in slobber knockle? Snap, step, kick. And Steve got really good, and the numbers showed that he could stay in the zone even when those things were happening. The other thing, in terms of kicking field goals, I mean, we've all seen it. There are 30 seconds left in the game, and the football game is riding on whether the field goal goes through. My wife, Debbie, will oftentimes say to me, how much more time is left in that football game? And I'll say to her, it's only 3 minutes, only 3 minutes. And Debbie will say to me, is that 3 minutes football time or 3 minutes earth time? Because if it's 3 minutes, and I'll say 3 minutes football time, and Debbie will say, well, that's 45 minutes earth time, given the commercials, given the timeouts, given the 2-minute warning and all that. So anyway, we've all seen it, particularly when you're playing at the other, you're the visiting team and all the people in the stands are going, And you get up to, kick the ball, and the other team calls a timeout. It didn't matter to Steve. He came up with a way of staying in the zone no matter what. That football is going through that uprights no matter how many timeouts they call and no matter how much the people in the stands are going. The other thing is that Steve, by football standards, is a little guy. He's a little guy. And he said, if I'm going to be the little guy, I'm going to really be well-developed little guy, and strong. A lot of kickers, after they kick the ball, that's it. That's not with Steve. If he sees that the line is not getting, is not making the tackle, he goes in to make the tackle. And what I've left out, Steve Weatherford has a body you could kill for. He became, again, how do you turn your liabilities into assets? And he did that in terms of developing physical routines. And it reached a point finally where people noticed this. And for example, his fellow teammates would come to him. A guy would come to him and say, I'm a tight end, and I'm getting the ball, and the ball's being thrown to me, and I'm looking downfield for the end zone, and the next thing you know, I've dropped the ball. How do I stay in the zone, Steve? You seem to be able to do that. How do you do that? And Steve started teaching them. In other words, the person who was once the walking fruitcake is now teaching other people. I think there is so much for us to learn from this. So much for us to learn from this. Sometimes some of our assets, our liabilities, really should be taken out of us hook, line, and sinker. There's some liabilities that are that way. And if that is your case, my suggestion for you, go to the bookstore. Go get Myrtle Fillmore's Healing Letters. That is a perfect book to read to learn how to get rid of liabilities that need to go out hook, line, and sinker. Myrtle Fillmore, remember, was told she had only a few more months to live, and it was tuberculosis. And back then, tuberculosis is what, cancer is today. Myrtle Fillmore recovered. Myrtle Fillmore made her transition in 1931, and it had absolutely nothing to do with tuberculosis. So there are some liabilities which, yes, need to be taken away hook, line, and sinker. But I believe there are many other liabilities, things that we look at liabilities, which are actually natural gifts, assets, traits, instincts, which we've been given for good reason. They're supposed to operate at 40 decibels. The problem is we've allowed them to operate at 340 decibels. At 40 decibels, these are assets. At 340 decibels, they're liabilities. It sort of reminds me of the story of the psychiatrist who goes to the patient and says, I'm going to draw pictures, and I want you to tell me what they make you think of. So he first draws a line, says to the patient, what does that remind you of? The patient says, sex. And he says, okay, draws a circle. He says, what does that remind you of? And the patient says, sex. He draws a cross. He says, what does that remind you of? And the patient said, sex. Doctor looks at him and says, you seem to be thinking about sex a lot. And the patient said, don't blame me, doc. You're the one drawing the pornographic pictures. And again, I do not believe that we are connected to a one-size-fits-all kind of God. I believe that we are connected to a hold the pickles, hold the lettuce, special orders, do not upset us kind of God. If we look at Jesus, there were times, many different ways which he did healing. There were some times where it was instantaneous. There were other times, I love the story where Jesus is dealing with a person who's blind. He puts water in the mud, and then he puts the mud in the man's eye, and he says, can you see now? And the man says, well, it's a little better, but people look like walking trees. And Jesus says, wait a minute. He puts some more and does something else. He puts it again in the man's eyes. And the man says, yeah, now I can see. It sort of makes me think of Jesus as the great optician. Is it better this way or better this way? You know, there is not one size fits all. But I think for many of us, what we are viewing as liabilities, if we could get it from 340 or 240 down to 40 decibels, which is where that was supposed to operate at, we would find that all of a sudden, what we first looked at as liabilities now become assets. How do we do this? Well, first, I think it's really important that we develop, and just like Steve Weatherford, rigorously, we really develop a system of daily prayer and meditation. And, you know, there's not one way of doing it. But as, you know, the Nike ad says, just do it. It's important to do it and to be committed to this. And as we do this, we can start to, this is not beating ourselves up or anything else like that. I think beating ourselves up over liabilities is sort of counterfeit of doing spirituality. We can do it in a way where we see our liabilities, and now comes the really great news. It is not our job to be Mr. or Mrs. Fix-It. It is not our job. As that great Unity teacher Eric Butterworth said, our first job is not to set things right. Our first job is to see things right, to see things right. And when we open up, we come in contact and flow with the bright winds of the Spirit. And we actually find that it is Spirit which is carrying us along and is changing things which were 340 decibels down to 40 decibels. The analogy I think of, my grandfather was a skilled carpenter. He died before I was born, but my father learned carpentry from my grandfather. My father could saw and saw for, go on for 25 minutes sawing. He'd say, all right, Ricky, now you try it. I couldn't saw for more than 10 seconds. And my father would say, you're fighting the wood, you're fighting the wood. You go with the flow of the wood. If you go with the flow of the wood, the saw just goes through. And when we become spiritually aligned, when we become spiritually centered, when we become open to that beyond that is within, then the saw can go on. And we start to speak, we find incredible changes. Sometimes there's small things that are happening to us. Sales clerks who we might have cussed out in the past, we're now able to get along with. Long lines which are not moving, we're now in a situation where we can start looking at calamity and responding with serenity. If we get there and there's only one shopping cart left, and that shopping cart has woogity wheels, we can, in Jesus' words, count it all joy. It really starts to come alive in us, and that song which Nikki sang really starts to come alive for us. Amazing, amazing, you will do amazing things. Amazing, amazing, you will do amazing things. Don't just sit there all alone. Get up out of your comfort zone, and you will do amazing things. Thank you, and God bless.